Hey guys, Z-Rate Easeps here for CSM Practice. Thanks for joining us. Today we're going to talk about why it's so important to listen to customers. It is actually so important that companies like Oracle have complete voice of the customer programs, because listening to customers can really help us better understand how can we improve and deliver an appropriate experience for them as they go through this journey of maximizing value with us. But it's a bit tricky, right? How do we do it correctly? How do we do it in a way that actually helps us understand every aspect of the customer success manager's touch points during the high touch engagement model, as well as how can we put in enough surveys or questionnaires, or how do we capture feedback beyond surveys to feed well into an appropriate and effective digital engagement. So today we're super lucky to have one of the customer success community's favorite thought leaders, Peter Armaly, who's also the Senior Director and Advisor for Oracle's SaaS customer success, I should say. He's also on our advisory board for CSM Practice. So thank you, Peter, for everything that you do for our community. Today, basically, you're going to take us through what Oracle does to get feedback from customers, how you do it, when do you do it, how you're thinking about designing the voice of the customer program to just really make your customer success strategy more efficient.
Thank you, Arit, for that wonderfully warm introduction. Yeah, voice of the customer is one of my more favorite topics in customer success. I feel like, in a way, it's not as central to the core of the way people think as it probably needs to be. And I say that because I talked to a lot of customers over the years, and oftentimes they know I'm representing whatever company I'm working at, but they feel like there's still a distance between the service they're getting and their ability to kind of influence it in a bigger way. They respond to surveys and stuff, but I think customers would feel that they needed kind of a voice. And so the voice of the customer programs, I feel, are really critical imperatives for customer success organizations. Otherwise, how are you going to know that the service you're providing or delivering in the market actually has the impact you hope and expect it, other than through crude instruments like retention and growth? Those are great metrics to focus on, of course, but you want more of a fine-grained understanding, I think, of each aspect of your service to really understand how it can be improved.
Yeah, so it sounds like there's two aspects in designing an appropriate voice of the customer program. One is internal. When should we capture feedback from customers so we can optimize our customer journey and their experience with us? And then I love this other aspect that you shared. If we are going to set something like that up, how do we make sure that the customers feel like the feedback that they provide actually has an impact on their journey, that they are able to influence it? Maybe you could talk about how did you approach the design of the voice of the customer framework?
The way we think about voice of the customer for our program is that we have to think really comprehensively, because Oracle also has parts of the company that are focused on understanding the customer, but in different phases of their life cycle. And what you're seeing on the screen here is really what's highlighted in the white bars here is really where customer success is kind of managing this aspect of the broader voice of the customer program. The marketing organization has some influence or kind of oversight of listening to the customer during the sales cycle. And also at the tail end, the marketing organization gets involved again around the renewal and expansion and what they think of as advocacy, which is really more around customer reference program. But for this discussion, I'd like to focus on how we think of it during these phases here. We call it provisioning, which is really just provisioning the application onto the cloud infrastructure. So customer success is involved during these 5 elements. So provision, onboard, implement, go live, and adoption. And so for our program at this point, that's what we focus on. We look at how the customer perceives the service at each of these phases. So then we're touching them, we're actually surveying them at each of these junctures. And so it's pretty straightforward. It's easy to asking the customer really clear-cut questions around, what did you think about the provisioning piece? Was it kind of seamless to you? Was it easy to deal with and understand? Same for onboarding. It gets a little more complicated when we ask them around the implementation piece because there's a lot of elements to that. So we're not as fine-grained at this moment as maybe we should be, but we don't want to over-survey our customers either. So we always have to think about asking them questions, but not too many questions. And so it becomes a little more complicated, like I said, around implementation, not so much around go live. That's just a single event. It's easy to ask them a question, get feedback from them. Adoption's a lot trickier because, as we all know, adoption can take some time. There's a lot of elements to it. There's a lot of kind of micro tasks that CSMs are responsible for delivering during the adoption phase. We've really just focused during the adoption phase on the QBRs. We asked them, was that valuable? How would you suggest we improve those things? So the framework, as you can see, involves those five for us, customer success, those five elements of the phases of the journey. When we're not involved in those grayed out areas, the sales cycle, renewal, expansion, advocacy, terminating, marketing kind of oversees those things. But we're involved there in terms of passing them information. During the adoption phase, depending on the responses of the customer and other kind of channels that we're looking at as well, if we can kind of understand that this customer is probably a good candidate for advocacy and customer reference, we will pass them as a lead over to the next organization, which is marketing, and they will nurture that individual to see if, in fact, they are a good candidate and maybe a viable candidate to do additional things like customer references or advocacy work on behalf of Oracle.
It's one of the things that you said as a guideline to just start thinking about when to have those, I would say, feedback points instead of saying surveys, because we don't really just want to do surveys. Like you said, could be very overwhelming for customers. Is first and foremost, just think about what are the feedback milestones. What it looks like to me is that you focus on the areas where the CSM is being involved. And this voice of the customer is really owned by your team because it's there to serve essentially the leadership and the CSMs to know what do we need to do to improve the specific customer experience and overall our strategy. You kind of touched on, you don't want to survey them too much. And I think that's where you have the multi or the omni-channel to serve feedbacks. Tell me a little bit about that. How do you kind of shy away from that risk of surveying too much? If you liked what you've heard so far, that's awesome. More coming in a second here, but in the meantime, I want you to click that like button so that YouTube knows that this is great content and you can start sharing it with others.
For now, as we've rolled this out, we focus on what we think are the important milestones for the customer and the moments in their journey where they're probably feeling like this is an important juncture. And it makes sense that the vendor might want to hear what our opinion is. And so we just focus on a small number during the moment of provisioning. Did it go well? How did your onboarding go? The implementation going well? And really around the go live event where it goes into production, that's really a critical point. Obviously, there's a lot of eyes on that. And we would want to know how the customer perceived the customer success service at that point, how valuable it was. And during adoption, we just focus on the QBRs, the executive business reviews, because those are obviously moments when the customer is providing feedback and hopefully being engaged in what comes next. And we would want to know whether those kinds of meetings are useful for them. And so then we can kind of learn how to improve the service.
So I want to say, I think there's different criteria to decide the moments of feedback collection up to the point of adoption and after the point of adoption. And the way that I see it, I think that, the first phase of up to go live or after first value delivered is a critical phase. We know statistically that customers that do not have a great experience or don't arrive to value, 30% of them will churn in year one. So it's really critical to nail that. And it sounds like that up to that point, your decision factor is what are the key milestones or key moments of truth in that critical period in the customer's life cycle that I, as a vendor, need to sample and get the feedback from the customers to make sure that I nail those moments. Would that be a true statement? And then you also said, don't do more than 4 or 5, kind of extrapolate.
Yeah, it is an absolutely true statement because I feel, and we know that customers' sensitivity is quite high. During that time, there's a lot of investment made, commitment made on their side and they want to make sure that this goes well. And so if for some reason things are stumbling, we'd want to know about that. And we'd also want to know if things are going well so that we can even learn from that how we can improve our service.
Okay. And because we're going to sample them for feedback 4 or 5 times, you said one of the consideration is just make sure you include few questions.
That's right. We make sure we don't have an exhaustive survey because we actually survey a small focus group of customers and understand. I mean, there's a lot of literature in the market around that anyways, that you don't want your surveys too long because people will abandon them over X number of questions. We keep it very short.
Well, tell me then about the adoption phase. Are you applying the same rules? Because the way that I accustomed to making considerations around surveys or feedback in general for the adoption phase is a bit different. In other words, if during the early stages, we're looking for critical moments of truth, in the adoption phase, that means, the customer's already started using it, but they're now coached and they're getting to incorporate your software into their day-to-day processes over a period of time, more users, more processes, more use cases with the same features, functions, and everything else that they bought. And so the adoption phase sometimes takes a year. Sometimes it could take 2 years before they go into an expansion. And because it's such a long period of time, I wouldn't just necessarily pick one because the way that I would look at it is that there's provision to go live, and then the adoption usually is broken down to multiple moments of feedback with customers. And most companies that I worked with would actually say, we're looking for areas where the customer should be getting a lot of value, or the customers is putting a lot of resources in place in order to get that done. For example, a QBR, they're usually going to dedicate a lot of resource to participate in the meeting. Maybe it's like a half-day meeting on site. So that might include also additional training. It could include a health check or participating in your conference, and all kinds of moments where they either add more resources and it's a bit more intensive. So they are expecting or some sort of value out of that. Before we continue, don't forget, subscribe to our YouTube channel and smash that notification button so that you don't miss out on any new videos.
The way we think about it is that because there's other organizations at Oracle are also surveying the customer during this period, during adoption. So we'd have Oracle University surveying the customer because they see that the customer is consuming educational content. They would be surveyed about that. So we need to be sensitive about that in addition to whatever effort we're putting into questioning or asking the customer. So we need to be really careful with this. This is still relatively new to us. We're just learning what's too much, what's not enough. We want to learn more about what the customer perception is. Surveys, as I mentioned, we just do it around the QBRs, but in between, we understand that the CSM is working with the customer on the success plan. So there's that kind of steady level of engagement, and we rely on the CSM to also triangulate with us to make sure that what the survey says is also kind of true, what they're experiencing while they're engaging with the team at the customer, so that hopefully they match up and that the perceptions are true on both sides. And we understand that the customer is getting good value, or there's some struggles or challenges that they're facing that we need to kind of address. And we can also look at the same time, factor in customers' participation or engagement on our community. And that's a way to look at rounding out the view of the customer, factor in the extended channels into that, what we call the voice of the customer, of course, is that it needs to be more than just surveys. It needs to be surveys. It needs to be the CSM's kind of perception. It needs to be perhaps the customer's participation on an advisory board. It needs to be their support interactions. There's about a variety of kind of mechanisms or channels that we look at to really fill out the picture of what we like to think of as representing the customer in this program. And that's how we kind of figure out who's a good candidate for perhaps moving into an advocacy program further along.
Besides surveys, what did you deliberately include as part of your feedback channels? And is that your omni-channel strategy? Yes. Can you illustrate what those are? And then maybe we can talk about why did you provide those? Is it really just to avoid survey fatigue, or was there another objective behind including so many different feedback channels?
The reason we want to include more channels is because we think it provides more evidence. of, this is where it kind of blends a little bit into customer health kind of thinking. So the way, like we do in customer success, when we think about customer health, there's a variety of variables. We approach it in a similar fashion with the voice of the customer. So surveys is just really one way of gauging the opinion or the reaction or the perception of a customer. We can also look at, as I mentioned earlier, community. Community is a big way because Oracle has a really large customer community of 200,000 people, getting a lot of value from it. And our CSMs really encourage our customers to participate there, not as a way to get around kind of working with support. It's really around working with other customers to understand how they figure things out and get value from the solution. And so it's a way of kind of realizing value through a community of customers. And so that's an important way for us to understand, because you can observe how the customers are perceiving your solution, maybe you as a company, and the service itself through observing the way they're engaging on that platform. Other ways are the way they're consuming content from marketing or from customer success, because both organizations are dropping things into the customer's email or other kind of ways that they communicate with the customer. And so if we see them downloading white papers or downloading other kind of content, that's a variable that's important, that tells us something about their willingness to kind of learn more, or we can actually glean information about precisely where they're at in terms of their journey with the solution, in terms of the usage and stuff. When we say omni-channel, we're talking about those kinds of things that just augment the picture. And we're really just building this program out at the moment. We're kind of testing, we're working with a few customers to make sure that these are important things that they actually would pay attention to themselves and use. And so I think, as we go along, we'll get better and refine these things. Right now, we have kind of a nice little list of additional channels besides surveys, but it could grow or maybe even shrink over the next year or so.
Yeah, you're going to test out to see which feedback channel is more reliable, giving you more solid information. I really love how you thought about it like a health score, because, sometimes people lie in survey, but if you can get, reinforce the feedback or validate the feedback through other things that they do or say in other channels, then you get a better sense of what the real truth is. By the way, in your slide for highest visibility of our customer, most of the customer could cover as many as 20 feedback channels.
Yeah, that's the potential. That's a statement we've put in there to really pitch this to the senior leadership team as the potential of the program. And so it depends on how much we're willing to commit in terms of the team that's going to be focused on this, because it involves working with other elements of the company to tap into the right kind of technology and teams to make sure that we can do it programmatically and not kind of manual or ad hoc.
So we talked about who is collecting this data. We talked about marketing owning those green areas, whereas customer success, probably the operations team or strategy team is collecting, and then the data and the feedback and feeding back to marketing. So a little bit about cross-functional collaboration. We talked about the how. We have the surveys and multiple feedback channels. And we talked about when, which is the critical milestones and moment of truth in the customer's lifecycle journey. How do you collect the data? What systems are you using? And even more importantly, how do you then make sure that it filters back into strategic decisions at the CSM level or the leadership level to augment the customer journey and continuously improve your strategy?
At this point, I guess it'll be more theory because we're actually just building this out, but the plan is to utilize, as it shows in the bottom right of the screen there, Oracle products. So there's something called Customer Experience Unity. It's basically a really sophisticated database that consolidates information or data from a variety of different sources into a single kind of database that you can tap into. And so we would use that, we would leverage that technology to then communicate with the broader Oracle marketing automation system. Usually people typically know it as Eloqua, but that technology would allow us to communicate out and also tap into information that it's collecting from customer signals as well. In other words, that mechanism that you see down there of CX Unity and our customer lifecycle management database, which is our platform, which is what the CSMs use to do their day-to-day job, plugs into Oracle's Eloqua ecosystem to really in other words, send information into the marketing realm. at Oracle. And so marketing can tap into what customer success is collecting and vice versa. But the important point to address your second question around what happens in terms of actions, that CLM database there is really the interface for CSMs to use. And in it would be actions for them to take based on the results of the Voice of the Customer program. Today, they see the results of surveys. If a customer gives a low score to a survey, they get notified through CLM, and there's specific actions that they need to take to track, to basically chase those down with the customer to understand at a deeper level why they gave the score they gave. And so that would be expanded as more channels participate in this program and then automatically feed into CLM. And we'll build out actions or playbooks for what CSM should do. And actually more than that, what a digital program will do with that information. We're building out our digital platform in a really aggressive way. And we are factoring in probably next year more how the Voice of the Customer will drive digital actions for a lot of our below threshold accounts that we call them, which are right now being touched digitally and not by a high touch CSM.
Yeah, I think this is super innovative because most companies, they send out a survey, somebody analyzes it, they showcase it to management and then park it in some shared drive. That's like the most rudimentary way to do Voice of the Customer. And then maybe the next level is to send a few surveys, maybe the NPS survey once a year, collect the data. And maybe if you have like a sophisticated CS solution, you would have action items based on detractor, passive, and promoter. I think what's super innovative here is that you're actually looking at multiple feedback channels. Take the data, put it all in one unified system that then spits up action items for the CSM. So not only do they get visibility immediately to multiple channel feedback, almost immediately or very close to real time. And then in addition, it makes recommendations to next steps based on what the feedback is. So I think that's super smart. It's very actionable. And I know this is still morphing. You're a big company. Every step is like 100 mini steps to get there. But this is a great vision. I really like it. And then on the other left-hand side is the Voice of the Customer personnel. And so maybe we could double click on what does it really take for a large company to execute something like this, really have sort of like a governance model because there's so many people participating.
So it's important to point out at this point that this program, although being led by customer success and it will be managed by the customer success organization, its purview is more than just customer success. It'll be the combination of customer success and customer support. At Oracle, the two organizations roll up into the same executive vice president of all of product, but support and success are led by a single EVP for an organization called Application Service Excellence. And his vision is that customers will get a frictionless post-sales experience. Once they buy the product, it'll be ideally a very smooth experience to adopt it and get a lot of value from it. And what that means is that inside of Oracle, support and success have to work really tightly together in terms of its processes and leveraging AI and machine learning to continually improve, especially on the support side through the pattern matching of cases and all that kind of stuff, so they can really get better and drive improvements to the product. The purview of Voice of the Customer you see on the screen is really those two organizations' efforts. And so the Voice of the Customer personnel, it will report into customer success, it does, but it's just going to have 3 people for now. And we don't envision it growing. We actually think if this is designed and built properly, it'll leverage existing technology, and it's just a matter of operating the processes and driving the necessary improvements within the process, but also driving the organizations that need to be influenced to do the work they need to do. It could mean sales needs to be made aware that the work they're doing up front is causing downstream negative impact on customer, and for these reasons, and it's surfacing through our Voice of the Customer program. We can give sales really critical feedback. But ideally, I think a more important consideration is that this program should drive improvements to the products, because customers are experiencing products in a very intimate way during the customer success and support journey. And there's no better place to learn what the customer's needs are than during this period. And we need to be able to funnel that back. The VOC personnel would be responsible for continually refining this model to make sure that that process is very efficient and is actually being actioned by the product organizations.
You had another slide for us.
I do. It's really around the governance. And this is not, it says right there, industry recommended governance model. Similar to customer success, if you're going to put in a voice of the customer program, it needs executive leadership. It needs executive buy-in across the businesses because, think of it as the customer doesn't care about your individual organizations. They just want to work with your company and get value for their investment. And so the way this program should be approached is it should be endorsed at the highest level. And luckily, we have a leader who really believes in this. And so they have kind of blessed this. It means that each of the business areas need to commit to working with the voice of the customer program. And like I said, the VOC personnel, you can see it in the middle, our VOC program team will be responsible for working with lines of communication, which will be kind of programmatically set. They'll probably have a cadence of meetings with these people and regular kind of reports that go up, making clear that to everyone what's happening in the program, what information is being surfaced. Insights reports will be generated by this team. That'll be a way to communicate to each of the business leaders what's happening, in the customer world, what's their perceptions. We can see this from the information from the data, and this is how we can help you understand what the data is saying through surveys, but also through these other kind of omni-channel pieces. And at the bottom there, Oracle's made an agreement with Medallia, which is one of the VOC vendors out in the marketplace, a really strong one, to become our voice of the customer technology. We're not sure yet exactly how that's going to work with those other elements I showed on the previous screen, but that it probably will be complementary. We're working with Medallia at the moment, just kind of scoping out the work. At the moment, we'll probably just rely on them for surveys because that is kind of how they started. They've expanded much more into the whole customer experience kind of technology world. And so we'll grow our partnership with them, and probably in 2 years from now, if I came back and talked to you about this topic, it'll probably look a lot different in terms of the way the technology is supporting this program.
That's cool. And so the marketing tech business partner is essentially your internal SME for the CS, the voice of a customer vendor or the software. Your voice of the customer program team is not really necessarily an expert on the software. They might not even have permission to make those new surveys. They need to work with the marketing team, but they do the design analysis.
Yes, excellent point. I'm glad you brought that up because they're the ones who actually own the surveys. At this point, in the way Oracle thinks about it is marketing needs to own the whole kind of communication with customers. And it's because they do communicate with the market a lot. And so someone needs to coordinate that, and customer success isn't really the number one contributor to that. So it makes sense for us to work with them. And that's what that is representing there.
This was great. What are your next steps and essentially your future plans for the voice of the customer in the upcoming year or two?
We're right at a point where we're just kind of like launching that design. We've got meetings set up. We've got workshops set up with Medallia to kind of scope out the technology that they're going to help us with. That's the immediate plan. It's hard to say what's going to happen over the next 6 to 9 or 12 months. We'll build it out. We'll be doing a lot of testing of how effective that design is and what needs to be tweaked. Should there be more or less channels? I think we'll focus on a few channels to start, just to see if there's a way for us to kind of believe the information that maybe we're observing and whether it's relevant to this information we're collecting through surveys and stuff. And we have to get better at actually driving up the receptivity of customers to respond to surveys. It's not bad. It's better than kind of, I would say, industry average, but we would want to get more there. And we need to work with our high touch accounts so that they understand the value of responding to the surveys. And so we'll continue to work with our CSMs and coaching them on having the right conversations with customers. So there's a lot of moving parts to getting a voice of the customer program established and really fully operating in a kind of a big way. But we're pretty excited about it. I think it'll help us really understand our customers in a bigger way.
Have you considered yet, what are your success indicators to determine whether or not this initial pilot or initial phase is successful or not? Do you have any metrics that you're currently thinking about tracking?
The metrics we'll try and associate them with accounts leading towards renewal, see if there's a way we can kind of correlate that. So it would obviously need to be like a year or two kind of trajectory to monitor to see if our ability to kind of listen to them and drive actions is influencing that at all. So we need to be tying in with the customer health scores and identifying perhaps which accounts would be good candidates to really test the value of this VOC program to improve the likelihood or drive up the propensity of a customer to think about renewing or even expanding.
Yeah.
Because maybe there's a way for the VOC program to drive the necessary actions that would otherwise not be known.
The way I would think about it is probably think about internal success indicators and external success indicators, meaning cross-functional as well as customer, because you are going to provide value to both. And then within the customer success indicators, I would look at leading and lagging indicators. So you mentioned a couple of lagging indicators, which is the upsell and did they renew or not, which takes forever to prove.
It does.
I think there's some leading indicators to say, okay, for the ones that we collected the feedback and had an immediate follow-up by the CSM or other teams, is the next survey higher? So are we seeing an increase of customer satisfaction, advocacy in that core group where we actually did take action on? And we know that if they do advocacy or the customer satisfaction is higher, or they opted into additional features and functions, so the adoption is going higher, those are leading indicators to upsell and retention.
Right.
So you could actually prove value a lot faster on the customer side, but just tracking leading indicators. And you really just want to prove the correlation.
Yeah, the one thing we're being held to producing right now is they call them leads, customer reference leads. It's really a kind of a marketing view on things, but that's important to them. The number one thing you guys can really help us with right out of the gate is identifying good leads for customer references. So for us, that's, I'm not going to say it's easy, but probably the simplest thing to do with this program right now is identify who are the best reference candidates and then let them deal with it. So that's a leading indicator. I would think authentic advocacy is a probably more important kind of leading indicator. And there's ways to measure advocacy candidates more, that I weigh them more than I do a customer reference. I agree with you. There's leading indicators that would probably be, we could list those things, and they are more immediate than the first two things I mentioned, the renewal and the growth, which are obviously important, but take time to come true.
Peter, thank you so much. Quite an insightful topic. I think it's such an important program to have for any size of organization. Any last words, any last tips for our audience?
I would just say, like I say to a lot of people about these topics, is it's work. It's hard work, but it'll be really gratifying work too, because at the end of the day, you're doing it for the betterment of your business in service to your customers, and your customers will be happier. They're always happier when they feel you're listening to them. And if you don't have this program in place, I don't think they get that impression that you're listening.
Guys, if you want to download the slides, the link is in the description to the YouTube video. And guys, I'll see you at the next video.
Thanks for having me, Orit.